The morning sun painted golden streaks across the polished badge lying on the wooden desk. The newly appointed sheriff picked it up, feeling its weight in his hands, not just the physical weight, but the responsibility it carried. After 15 years of dedicated service in law enforcement, this moment felt surreal. He had started as a young state trooper, walking the beat and getting to know every shop owner, grandmother, and kid on his patrol route. Those early days taught him that real police work wasn't about power, it was about community. While others saw quotas and statistics, he saw faces and stories. He'd help elderly folks carry their groceries, shoot hoops with teenagers after his shift, and make sure every lost kid found their way home. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. Through the years, he climbed the ranks, not by playing politics, but by staying true to his principles. He became known as the officer who'd take the time to listen, who'd find solutions instead of just making arrests. When a local youth center was about to close, he organized fundraisers and rallied the community to save it. When tension rose between police and residents, he started monthly community meetings where people could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. The decision to apply for the sheriff position wasn't an easy one. He knew it would mean facing challenges bigger than anything he'd encountered before. The county had its share of problems: strained community relations, outdated training programs, and a desperate need for modern policing approaches. But where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunities for real change. The appointment committee's decision had been unanimous, though it hadn't been made public yet. That would come Monday morning, with all the formal announcements and press conferences. For now, he savored this quiet moment, thinking about his father who'd always taught him to stand up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. His phone buzzed, a message from his predecessor about meeting for a private handover briefing. He needed to head out soon. Looking in the mirror, he adjusted his tie one last time. The reflection showed more gray at his temples than when he'd started his career, but his eyes still held the same determination. He'd earned every one of those gray hairs serving his community. Picking up his car keys, he thought about all the changes he planned to implement. Body cameras for transparency, improved de-escalation training, community oversight committees, ideas he'd developed from years of seeing what worked and what didn't on the streets. But first, he needed to understand the department from the inside out. The weather forecast predicted one of the hottest days of the summer. As he stepped out of his house, the heat already pressing down like a heavy blanket, he had no idea that this scorching Sunday would test everything he stood for in ways he never imagined. His personal car, a modest sedan he'd maintained meticulously over the years, sat waiting in the driveway. The same car that would soon become part of a story that would change not just his life, but an entire police department. Little did he know that in just a few hours, he'd find himself in a situation that would put all his experience, principles, and humanity to the test. The badge in his pocket felt heavier with each step. It represented not just authority, but the responsibility to bring about the change he'd been working toward his entire career. The next chapter of his life was about to begin, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. The digital display on his car dashboard flashed 2:15 p.m. as he cruised down Oak Valley Road. The summer heat had turned the asphalt into a shimmering river, and even with the air conditioning at full blast, he could feel the intensity of the sun through his windshield. He'd chosen to drive his personal car today, a sensible blue sedan that had never given him trouble in the 7 years he'd owned it. His mind wandered to the meeting ahead. The current sheriff had agreed to brief him privately about ongoing cases and department dynamics, information that wouldn't be in any official reports. He was mentally reviewing his questions when red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Years of law enforcement experience kicked in automatically. He checked his speed, exactly at the limit. His seatbelt was on, signals working, and he'd just had his car inspected last week. Everything was in perfect order as always. He eased his foot onto the brake and pulled over smoothly, positioning his car safely on the shoulder. 2 officers approached his vehicle, one on each side. Through his side mirror, he noticed their hands already resting on their holsters, an unnecessarily aggressive stance for a routine traffic stop. The older officer, sporting a crew cut and mirrored sunglasses, tapped on his window with a knuckle. Following the procedures he'd taught countless times himself, he kept his hands visible on the steering wheel and lowered his window. The blast of hot air that rushed in made him blink. "Good afternoon, officer," he said calmly. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "Broken taillight," the officer replied curtly, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "License and registration." He knew for certain his taillights were working. He checked all his lights every morning, a habit formed during his early days on the force. "Officer, I just had my car inspected last week. All my lights are in working order." The second officer, younger and visibly tense, moved closer to the passenger window. "Sir, when an officer tells you something's wrong with your vehicle, it's wrong with your vehicle. License and registration now." The situation felt off. He'd conducted thousands of traffic stops himself, trained junior officers in proper procedure. This wasn't it. The aggressive stance, the confrontational tone, the obvious lie about the taillight, all red flags. Still, he kept his voice steady and movements slow as he reached for his documents. "My license is in my wallet, in my back pocket," he explained, maintaining clear communication. "I'm going to reach for it now." The summer heat pressed in through the open window, but something colder was building in the air between him and these officers. As he carefully extracted his wallet, he caught fragments of their radio chatter, something about a suspect description from earlier that day. He'd seen this before, the way some officers would fish for reasons to stop certain drivers, hoping to get lucky with a match to an unrelated case. The older officer snatched his license with unnecessary force. Looking at it, his eyebrows raised slightly, probably noting the address from a more affluent part of town. But instead of this diffusing the situation, the officer's demeanor grew more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," came the sharp command. A command that went against all standard procedure for a simple traffic violation. The second officer had already taken an aggressive stance, hands still hovering near his weapon. In that moment, the soon-to-be sheriff faced a choice. He could reveal his position, pull rank, and end this immediately. But years of experience told him something more important was happening here. This stop, this moment, was exactly why he'd pursued the sheriff's position in the first place. It was a stark reminder of the changes needed in the department he was about to lead. What happened next would test not just his patience and principles, but potentially change the entire culture of law enforcement in their county. The sun beat down mercilessly as he carefully considered his next move, knowing that the next few minutes would ripple far beyond this dusty roadside encounter. With measured movements, he stepped out of his car into the shimmering heat. The asphalt radiated warmth through his dress shoes as both officers positioned themselves uncomfortably close. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he kept his composure, drawing from 15 years of experience handling tense situations. "Sir, do you know why we really stopped you?" the older officer asked, his tone suggesting the taillight excuse had been exactly what the soon-to-be sheriff suspected, a pretext. The question hung in the air like the heavy summer heat. "No, officer, I don't," he replied calmly, maintaining eye contact despite the officer's mirrored sunglasses. "My taillight is working perfectly, as you can verify yourself. I'd appreciate knowing the real reason for this stop." The younger officer circled behind him, boots crunching on loose gravel. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, the vagueness of the statement all too familiar. "Your vehicle matches a description." A classic excuse he'd heard countless times before, and had even called out during department training sessions. His car, a common blue sedan, could match the description of thousands of vehicles. He knew this game all too well, had spent years working to change these very practices. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," he began diplomatically, "but I need to point out that this stop appears to lack probable cause. I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to speak with your supervisor." His reasonable request seemed to touch a nerve. The older officer stepped closer, using his height to try to intimidate. "Oh, you're one of those who knows the law, huh? Hands against the vehicle now." Despite the clear violation of his rights, he complied, placing his palms on the hot metal of his car. The heat burned against his hands, but he didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to expose a broken system was to let it reveal itself. "I'm a law enforcement officer," he stated calmly as they began an unnecessarily rough pat-down. "My credentials are in my wallet along with my driver's license." "Sure you are," the younger officer scoffed, continuing the aggressive search. "And I'm the President of the United States." The older officer pulled his wallet out again, deliberately dropping its contents onto the hot pavement. Credit cards, receipts, and his folded credentials scattered across the ground. Neither officer moved to pick them up. "We're going to search your vehicle now," the older officer declared, not asking for consent. "Any objections?" "Yes, I object," he stated firmly. "You have no probable cause, and I do not consent to a search. I again request to speak with your supervisor." The tension ratcheted up several notches. Both officers exchanged looks, the kind he'd seen before when some officers decided to teach someone a lesson about challenging their authority. "Out here, we are the authority," the older officer growled. "And your attitude is really starting to make us wonder what you're hiding." He could feel the situation spiraling, but kept his voice steady. "Officers, everything about this stop has been recorded on my dashboard camera. I suggest we all take a step back and handle this professionally." That statement wasn't entirely true. He didn't have a dash cam, but he needed to create pause for thought. Instead, it seemed to anger them further. The younger officer grabbed his arm roughly while the older one produced handcuffs. "That's it. You're officially being detained for interfering with an investigation," the older officer announced, the handcuffs clicking shut with unnecessary force. "Maybe some time to cool off will adjust your attitude." As they led him toward their patrol car, he remained silent, documenting every detail in his mind. The exact time, the badge numbers partially visible despite their attempts to obscure them, every word exchanged. He knew that what was about to happen would either break him or become the catalyst for the changes he'd fought for throughout his entire career. The patrol car's back door opened with a heavy creak. As they pushed him inside, the scorching air trapped within the vehicle hit him like a wall. They'd clearly left it sitting in the sun with windows up and no ventilation, a tactic he'd specifically banned during his previous supervisory roles. The door slammed shut behind him, and through the window, he could see them laughing, preparing to take their time with the vehicle search they had no right to conduct. What they didn't know was that their actions today would have consequences far beyond what they could imagine. The heat pressed in around him as the first test of his future leadership began taking shape in the most unexpected way. Inside the patrol car, time seemed to slow down. The temperature rose steadily as the afternoon sun turned the vehicle into an oven. Sweat trickled down his back, soaking through his dress shirt. He'd chosen this outfit carefully for his meeting with the outgoing sheriff, a meeting that now seemed impossibly far away. Through the windshield, he watched the two officers taking their time with his car. They opened every compartment, pulled out his gym bag, and scattered his papers across the seats. Each minute that passed made the air inside the patrol car thicker, heavier. The handcuffs bit into his wrists as he shifted, trying to find a position that would allow him to breathe more easily. "Officers," he called out, keeping his voice steady despite the growing discomfort. "The temperature in here is becoming dangerous. Could you please crack a window?" His words bounced off the closed windows, met only with mocking smiles from the officers who pretended not to hear him. He'd dealt with heat exhaustion cases before, had even conducted training sessions about the dangers of leaving people in hot cars. The symptoms were starting to set in: the dizziness, the rapid heartbeat, the way his thoughts began to blur at the edges. But he forced himself to stay alert, to keep documenting everything in his mind. Outside, the older officer held up his phone, found in the car's center console. The screen was locked, and the officer's frustration was visible even through the patrol car's tinted windows. They were probably hoping to find something, anything, to justify their actions, but there was nothing to find. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The heat became a living thing, pressing down on his chest, wrapping around his throat. His polo shirt was completely soaked through now. He knew the dangers all too well. On a day like this, temperatures inside a closed car could rise to lethal levels within an hour. "Water," he called out again, seeing the younger officer return to the patrol car for something. "I need water." The officer just grabbed a clipboard and walked away, deliberately ignoring his request. In all his years of service, he'd never seen such a blatant disregard for basic human dignity. Through his increasingly blurred vision, he watched them finish searching his car, having found nothing suspicious, because there was nothing to find. The older officer was now running his license through their system, taking an unnecessarily long time with each keystroke. They were making him wait on purpose, letting him cook in the back seat. 45 minutes had passed. His heart was racing, and the world had started to tilt slightly. He'd attended enough medical training sessions to know he was approaching dangerous territory. Still, he forced himself to focus, to remember every detail. The badge numbers, the time, the way they laughed while looking at their phones, ignoring his presence in their backseat. Then something changed. He saw the older officer's body language shift as he stared at his computer screen. The casual arrogance disappeared, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. The officer called his partner over, pointing at the screen. Even through his heat-induced haze, he could read the panic in their movements. They had finally run his ID properly. They now knew exactly who they had locked in their patrol car for the past 45 minutes. Their new sheriff, the man who would be their boss starting tomorrow morning. The transformation was instant. Both officers rushed to the patrol car, fumbling with keys. The door flew open, and blessed cooler air rushed in. "Sir, we are so sorry," the older officer stammered, reaching for the handcuffs. "There's been a terrible mistake." But as they helped him out of the car, he knew this wasn't a mistake. This was exactly what he'd been fighting against his entire career. The profiling, the abuse of power, the casual cruelty, all of it laid bare in one afternoon. As he steadied himself against the car, still dizzy from the heat, he was already planning how this incident would become a turning point for the entire department. The officers stood there, faces pale, probably seeing their careers flash before their eyes. But they didn't yet understand that tomorrow would bring something very different from what they expected. This wouldn't be a story of revenge, it would be a story of transformation. First, though, he needed water, shade, and a moment to collect himself. The real work would begin in the morning. The computer screen in the patrol car glowed with information that made both officers feel like the ground had disappeared beneath their feet. The older officer blinked hard, hoping somehow the words would change. But there it was, clear as day, their department's incoming sheriff starting his tenure tomorrow morning. Their newest boss had just spent 45 minutes locked in their patrol car under the scorching sun. "This can't be right," the younger officer whispered, his face draining of color as he read the screen over his partner's shoulder. The profile showed an impressive career spanning 15 years, multiple commendations, and most terrifyingly, his new appointment as county sheriff. The older officer's hands trembled slightly as he rushed to open the car door. The blast of hot air that escaped made him wince. They both suddenly realized exactly what they'd put him through. Their new boss stumbled slightly as he got out, his clothes soaked with sweat, his breathing labored. "Water," the younger officer said, practically running to grab a bottle from their car. "Sir, please, have some water." The same water they'd denied him for nearly an hour now appeared instantly. The change in their behavior would have been almost comical if the situation wasn't so serious. As their future sheriff took careful sips of water, leaning against the car for support, both officers stood awkwardly, their earlier arrogance replaced by growing dread. They'd violated department procedures, abused their authority, and worse, they'd done it to the one person who would soon have complete authority over their careers. "Sir, we had no idea," the older officer began, his voice shaking slightly. "If we had known who you were." "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Their new boss cut him off, his voice hoarse but steady. "You shouldn't treat anyone this way, regardless of who they are." He took another sip of water, letting his words sink in. "Whether I'm your sheriff or just another citizen, what happened here was wrong." The younger officer started gathering the scattered contents of their boss's wallet from the ground, his hands shaking as he picked up each card and document. The credentials he'd earlier mocked now seemed to burn in his hands. "Your car, sir," the older officer said quickly. "We'll put everything back exactly as we found it." They'd both rushed to reorganize what they'd carelessly strewn about during their illegal search, painfully aware of their every movement being watched. Their new sheriff observed them silently, still recovering from his ordeal. Both officers kept glancing at him nervously, probably imagining the disciplinary actions to come. They'd heard rumors about other officers being fired for less. "We'll accept whatever punishment you decide," the older officer finally said, standing at attention. "We know we messed up badly." The younger officer nodded vigorously beside him, both expecting the worst. But their new boss wasn't looking at them with anger. Instead, his expression held something more complex, a mixture of determination and thoughtfulness that somehow made them even more nervous. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp, my office," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We're going to have a long conversation about what happened here today. And then," he paused, making sure he had their full attention, "we're going to use this incident to change things." The officers exchanged confused looks. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. Termination, suspension, angry threats, those they could understand. But this calm demeanor, this hint at something more constructive, threw them completely off balance. "Until then," he continued, straightening his damp shirt, "I suggest you both spend the evening thinking about every decision you made today, every assumption, every action. Because tomorrow, we're going to break down this incident step by step, and you're going to help me ensure nothing like this happens in our department again." He checked his watch. He was now very late for his meeting with the outgoing sheriff. "And officers," he added, looking at them both, "I want you to remember how it felt when you realized who I was. That moment of fear. That's how every citizen should make you feel if you're abusing your authority. Badge or no badge, every person deserves to be treated with dignity." As he got into his car, still slightly unsteady from the heat exposure, he could see them in his rearview mirror. Two officers who looked nothing like the arrogant bullies from an hour ago. Tomorrow would be their first lesson in the new way of doing things, and they didn't even realize yet that their biggest fear, losing their jobs, wasn't what awaited them. What awaited them was something far more challenging: the opportunity to become part of real, lasting change. The next morning arrived with a different kind of heat, the nervous energy radiating from two officers as they sat in the waiting area outside their new sheriff's office. They'd arrived 20 minutes early, both in freshly pressed uniforms, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Neither had slept much the night before. The older officer kept adjusting his collar, while his younger partner couldn't stop fidgeting with his hat in his lap. Both jumped slightly when the office door opened at exactly 8 a.m. Their new sheriff stood there, looking composed and professional in his uniform, showing no signs of yesterday's ordeal except for a slight sunburn on his face. "Come in, officers," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority they'd heard yesterday. The office was simple but neat, a few commendations on the walls, family photos on the desk, and a stack of folders waiting on the corner. The officers took their seats, backs straight, expecting the worst. "Before we begin," the sheriff said, settling into his chair, "I want you to understand something. This meeting isn't about punishment, it's about transformation." He opened one of the folders, revealing that incident report from yesterday, the one they'd hastily written after realizing who he was. "Let's start with this report," he continued. "You wrote that you stopped me for a broken taillight. We all know that wasn't true. So tell me, what really made you pull me over?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The older one cleared his throat, finding the courage to speak first. "Sir, we had a habit of making routine stops in that area, looking for certain types of vehicles and drivers." "Profiling," the sheriff said simply, letting the word land between them. "Let's call it what it is. Now, tell me about your training. Were you taught to handle stops this way?" Both officers exchanged glances before the younger one spoke up. "No, sir. We were taught proper procedure, but over time, we started following what other officers did. It became normal." The sheriff nodded, pulling out another folder. "I spent the evening reviewing both your records. Officer Chen, you have 4 commendations for community service. Officer Roberts, you've organized youth outreach programs. You're both capable of good police work. So what changed?" The question made both officers think deeply for the first time about how they'd gradually shifted away from their early ideals. The older officer spoke slowly, realization dawning in his voice. "I guess we started seeing threats everywhere instead of people. It became us versus them." "Exactly," the sheriff said, leaning forward. "And that's what we're going to change. Starting today, you're both being reassigned to help develop our new community policing program." The officers blinked in surprise. This wasn't at all what they'd expected. The younger one found his voice first. "Sir, you're not firing us?" "No," the sheriff replied, pulling out more documents. "That would be easy, for me and for you. Instead, you're going to help me fix the system that led to yesterday's incident. You'll start by taking advanced training in bias recognition and de-escalation techniques. Then, you'll help train other officers. He spread out several papers on his desk, training schedules, community meeting plans, new protocols for traffic stops. Your experience yesterday, both the mistakes and the realization, makes you perfect for this role. You'll help other officers understand why these changes are necessary. The older officer stared at the papers, his voice thick with emotion. Sir, why give us this chance? Because, the sheriff said, standing up to look out his window at the community below, real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding, from transforming those who've been part of the problem into part of the solution. He turned back to face them. You'll also both be attending weekly community meetings. You'll look into the eyes of people who've experienced what I experienced yesterday. You'll listen to their stories. And most importantly, you'll help rebuild the trust we've lost. The morning sun streamed through the window, highlighting the determination on all three faces. The officers sat straighter, beginning to understand that they weren't just being given a second chance. They were being given an opportunity to be part of something bigger than themselves. This won't be easy, the sheriff concluded. You'll face resistance from other officers. You'll have to confront your own biases. You'll have to work harder than you've ever worked before. Are you ready for that? Both officers stood up, a new sense of purpose visible in their stance. Yes, sir, they replied in unison, and for the first time since yesterday's incident, they'd felt something close to hope. The sheriff nodded, satisfied. Then let's get to work. We have a department to transform. He handed each of them a thick training manual. Your first community meeting is this afternoon. I suggest you spend the morning preparing and remembering what it felt like to be on the other side of that badge. 1 year had passed since that scorching summer day. The sheriff stood at the podium in the department's main conference room, looking out at the assembled faces, officers, community members, and local press. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls, all gathered to hear about the changes that had transformed their police department. A year ago, he began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room. 2 officers pulled me over and left me in a hot patrol car for 45 minutes. Today, those same officers stand before you as leaders in our community policing program. He gestured to the 2 officers, now sergeants, who sat in the front row. Their faces showed pride instead of shame, confidence instead of fear. The older officer had just won an award for developing a new training program. The younger one was running youth outreach initiatives that were making real differences in troubled neighborhoods. But this isn't just their story, the sheriff continued. This is about how one incident sparked a complete transformation of our department. He clicked a button, and statistics appeared on the screen behind him. Complaints against officers down by 70%. Use of force incidents reduced by 65%. Community satisfaction up by 80%. A hand rose from the audience, a local shop owner who'd once been vocal about police harassment. I've noticed the difference, she said, standing up. Officers now stop by to chat, get to know us. My grandson isn't afraid anymore when he sees a patrol car. The sheriff nodded, clicking to the next slide. Every officer now wears a body camera, he explained. But more importantly, every officer goes through extensive training in community engagement and bias recognition. The screen showed images of officers at community events, playing basketball with kids, helping elderly residents, attending neighborhood meetings. Remember those community meetings we started? The younger sergeant spoke up from his seat. At first, we dreaded them. Facing people who'd been profiled, hearing their stories, it was hard. But that's what changed us. We stopped seeing threats and started seeing neighbors. The older sergeant stood up next to him. We've trained over 200 officers from other departments now, he added. They come here to learn our new methods. The change is spreading beyond our county. The sheriff clicked to another slide showing dramatic decreases in racial disparities in traffic stops and arrests. These numbers tell a story, he said. But the real story is in the faces I see every day. Officers proud to serve, community members who trust us again. A teenage girl raised her hand next. Her father had been wrongfully arrested the year before. The officer who arrested my dad, she said, he came to apologize. Said he'd learned better. That never used to happen. The sheriff smiled, remembering how that particular officer had struggled with admitting his mistake, but ultimately found it liberating. Accountability isn't just about punishment, he explained. It's about growth, about learning from our mistakes. He showed more slides, new training programs, community oversight committees, transparent complaint procedures. But the most powerful images were the simple ones. Officers and citizens working together, talking, laughing, building trust. A year ago, I could have fired those 2 officers, he said, gesturing again to the sergeants. Instead, we chose a harder path, real transformation. Today, every traffic stop in our county is recorded. Every officer knows they're accountable. But more importantly, every officer understands why these changes matter. The older sergeant stood up again. We tell every new recruit our story, he said, about how we almost lost everything because we forgot who we were meant to serve. It's not just policy anymore, it's personal. The sheriff moved to his final slide, a simple photo of his badge next to a community service award. This badge means something different now, he said. It's not about power over people, it's about service to people. As the presentation ended, the room erupted in applause. Community members and officers mingled freely, sharing stories and ideas. The transformation wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was real and lasting. Later that evening, as the sheriff watched a patrol car stop to help a stranded motorist, he saw the officers handle the situation with respect and care. No profiling, no power plays, just public service as it was meant to be. The summer sun was setting, just as hot as that day a year ago, but everything else had changed. The 2 sergeants joined him outside. Hard to believe it's been a year, the younger one said, watching the patrol car. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes, the sheriff replied, but only if we're willing to learn from them. They stood together, watching as the patrol car's officers helped push the stranded vehicle to safety. This was what real policing looked like, serving the community, one interaction at a time. The transformation wasn't just in their procedures or policies, it was in their hearts and minds. And that made all the difference.